Welcome to part 3 of a 4-part narrated virtual tour series of U.S. military aircraft exhibited in the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum's Udvar-Hazy Center. The Sikorsky H5S served as the Marine Corps' primary medical evacuation helicopter in the final years of the Korean War. It carried wounded on internally mounted litters with an attendant, an improvement over the other light utility helicopters that required the wounded to ride outside of the fuselage while exposed to harsh conditions. It featured an opening front bubble for easy access, a rear-mounted engine configured to maximize internal carrying capacity, and offset rotor blade flapping hinges to improve control and stability, which made it ideal for night flying. In July 1952, this H5S was one of the first examples delivered to the Observation Squadron VM-06, which performed most helicopter-borne medical evacuations for wounded Marines in Korea, evacuating more than 5,000 seriously wounded personnel. It is one of only a handful of surviving Korean War helicopters. The Air Force purchased the Bell 47 for service under the H13 designation. Early in 1957, President Dwight Eisenhower's chief pilot decided that the Bell H13 Ranger was the ideal presidential helicopter, and the United States Air Force purchased 2 to fill this critical need. Bell added 2 features to the presidential H13s, all-metal rotor blades to increase the helicopter's useful load, and applied special anti-glare tinting to the huge plexiglass nose bubble. During a simulated nuclear alert stage to test how quickly the chief executive and other government officials could depart Washington, D.C., President Eisenhower became the first president to fly in this helicopter. The Sikorsky UH34D Seahorse was designed in 1952 for Navy anti-submarine warfare and evolved from the commercial Sikorsky S-58. It was initially designated the HSS-1 and went on to serve in combat assault and utility roles for the Army and Marine Corps. It was the primary Marine assault helicopter in the Vietnam War from 1962 until the arrival of the turbine-powered CH-46. This Marine UH-34D never served overseas, but has the markings of Marine Medium Helicopter Squadron 163, which saw extensive combat in Vietnam. The Chance-Vought F-8 Crusader was designed in 1953, satisfying a naval request for a new supersonic day fighter. Several innovations were incorporated into its design. The most unusual was a variable incident wing that could rotate about its rear spar, raising the entire wing, increasing a pilot's visibility. The entire leading edge and ailerons could be lowered to increase the effective camber of the wing and consequently reduce approach and landing speeds. Our F-8 Crusaders played a critical role during the Cuban Missile Crisis, providing intelligence on Soviet missiles that had transferred to Cuba. In 1957, Colonel John Glenn made his first supersonic transcontinental flight in a photo Crusader, flying from California to New York in 3 hours, 23 minutes, and 8.3 seconds. This aircraft is the RF-8G reconnaissance version and was transferred to the museum in 1987 and was the last operational F-8 in the U.S. Navy. The Republic aircraft F105 Thunderchief was a supersonic, single-seat fighter bomber that could carry nuclear weapons and heavy bomb loads over great distances at high speeds. With its size and range, it could carry double the F-100 bomb load further and faster. The F105D variant was an all-weather fighter bomber version fitted with radar for night or bad weather operations. The radar incorporated a terrain guidance mode permitting the pilot to descend below bad weather in unfamiliar territory and hug the ground, avoiding detection. Bombs were carried on multiple weapon racks on the center line of the fuselage and on wing pylons. They operated from bases in Thailand during the Vietnam War. On a typical mission over North Vietnam, the F105D carried 6 750-pound bombs or 5 1,000-pound bombs, along with 2 450-gallon drop tanks. It could carry 2.75-inch rocket pods, napalm canisters, as well as 4 AIM-9 Sidewinder infrared homing air-to-air missiles. The Thunderchief was somewhat less successful as an air-to-air weapon, often challenged by enemy MiG-17 and MiG-21 fighters. Thunderchiefs in Vietnam flew more than 20,000 combat missions, with 350 Thunderchiefs lost in combat, most of them to North Vietnamese anti-aircraft fire. It was calculated that an F-105 pilot stood only a 75% chance of surviving 100 missions over North Vietnam. In 1954, the U.S. Army launched a design competition for a new medical evacuation helicopter. The turbine engine represented a revolutionary step in the development of helicopters, and the Army saw it as a critical component in the new medevac helicopter design. Compared to the reciprocating piston engine, the turbine was lighter, smoother, easier to maintain, and much more reliable. The new aircraft was designated HU-1A Iroquois, hence the name Huey, and officially christened the Iroquois in keeping with the Army tradition of naming helicopters after American Indian tribes. In 1960, U.S. Army General Hamilton House was promoting the idea of moving Army infantry around the battlefield using helicopters rather than trucks. The Army created the 11th Air Assault Division to test Howe's theory, resulting in the Army fundamentally changing the way it rode into battle, introducing a new type of warfare several years later on the other side of the world, in Vietnam. All branches of the U.S. military operated Bell UH-1 Iroquois, and they ranged to every corner of South Vietnam and into Cambodia and Laos. It was in Vietnam that the Army and Marine soldiers first tested the new tactic of air mobile warfare. In a typical air assault mission, Huey helicopters inserted infantry deep in enemy territory. Huey gunships equipped with machine guns, rockets, and grenade launchers often escorted the transports. Hueys carrying troops were nicknamed Slicks because they were not cluttered with externally mounted rockets or guns. As the Slicks approached the landing zone, the gunships swooped down and sprayed rockets and machine gun fire into areas that might conceal enemy forces. The U.S. Army Aviation Museum, Fort Rucker, Alabama, restored this Huey until the National Air and Space Museum acquired the aircraft in 1995. Working closely with the Navy, McDonnell engineers attempted to design what it considered to be the Navy's requirements into the company-financed model, resulting in the AH-L. Further changes were applied with the outcome designated F4H-L, the Navy's first Mach 2 carrier-based aircraft capable of carrying Sparrow missiles. It would be a one- or two-place aircraft, and its primary mission was as an all-weather fleet air defense aircraft, although it retained its original initial attack capability. The Navy chose the two-seat version, designated McDonnell F-4B Phantom II, for production. The Phantom II was qualified for both land and sea operations, and within a few years several versions were produced for the U.S. Air Force. In 1962, the Navy designations were the F-4A, B, G, and J, with the Air Force versions being the F-4C, D, and E. In 1968, the Navy chose the F-4J for its Blue Angels flight demonstration team, and in 1969, the Air Force chose the F-4E for its Thunderbird team. A reconnaissance version without armament but using the same basic configuration and engines was designated the RF-4C. When production ended in 1979, a total of 5,195 had been built. On November 28, 1988, this aircraft left the Marines for the National Air and Space Museum, at which time it had amassed a total of 5,075 flight hours, with 6,804 landings, 1,337 were arrested, and 1,163 catapult shots off the deck of a carrier. The Sikorsky HH-52 Seagard was the U.S. Coast Guard's first turbine-powered helicopter and the first that could land on water next to vessels or personnel in distress without using awkward floats, making it the most effective air-sea rescue helicopter of its time. It was originally developed as a commercial S-62 during the late 1950s. It combined the dynamic elements of the Sikorsky S-55 with a bolt hull-shaped fuselage and a single lightweight turboshaft engine. The U.S. Coast Guard procured 99 S-62s, which it originally designated as the HU-2S-1G Seagard, and later redesignated it as the HH-52A Seagard. The Seagard fleet was active for 26 years, during which it reportedly was responsible for rescuing over 15,000 people from various forms of life-threatening situations. It was withdrawn from U.S. Coast Guard service during 1989 in favor of non-amphibious rotorcraft such as the Eurocopter HH-65 Dolphin, which relies solely on the use of a winch from a low hover to conduct rescue operations. The Gyrodyne QH-50- was the first drone helicopter to enter operational service, the first rotorcraft deployed with nuclear armament, and one of the first armed unmanned aerial vehicles. The introduction of Soviet nuclear-powered submarines in the early 1960s created an immediate demand for a remotely piloted helicopter that could operate from smaller, older destroyers and could carry a Mark 57 nuclear depth bomb or 2 torpedoes. Most QH-50 deployments consisted of anti-submarine patrols with torpedoes, but several craft were used during the Vietnam War primarily for spotting naval gunfire. Gyrodyne built 758 airframes, most of which went to the U.S. Navy. A 1957 Navy specification for an attack airplane to replace the aging Douglas AD/A1 Skyraider resulted in the Grumman A6 Intruder. The Marine Corps initiated the request with a desire for a close air support aircraft capable of short takeoff. At the same time, the Navy's experience in the Korean War showed the need for a new long-range strike aircraft with a high subsonic performance at treetop level to permit under-the-radar penetration of enemy defenses and capable of finding and hitting small and moving targets in any weather. The first A6As were delivered to the Navy in 1963 and to the Marines in 1964. The first Intruder operational squadron supporting U.S. forces in Vietnam was in 1965, flying off the carrier USS Independence. The digital integrated attack and navigation equipment and its subsystems enabled the crew to attack pre-selected targets at night or under adverse weather conditions without having to look out of the cockpit during a mission. 19 A6 models were modified to A6Bs for Iron Hand missions, the suppression of enemy anti-aircraft missiles. Since Vietnam, A6s made effective all-weather strikes against targets in Libya during the Gulf of Sidra crisis, against Iran gunboats in the Persian Gulf, and against Iraqi installations during Desert Storm operations. Intruders equipped with target recognition attack multi-sensors were responsible for 85% of the laser designations and laser-guided bomb drops during Desert Storm. Its last combat missions were over Bosnia in 1994, and the last Intruders were retired in 1997. During its flying career, the museum's Intruder accumulated more than 7,500 flying hours, more than 6,800 landings, of which 767 were arrested landings, and 712 catapult launches. I hope you enjoyed this narrated virtual tour of U.S. military aircraft displayed in the Udvar-Hazy Center of the National Air and Space Museum. The museum is in Chantilly, Virginia, outside of Washington, D.C., is free to visit, but there is a $15 parking fee. If you would like to tour other aircraft in this series, convenient links are in the description section below this video. Here are YouTube's suggested links on similar topics that you may enjoy.